somewhere on an island in northern Iran, there's an unmarked grave. No headstone, no name. His own people made sure of that. He was buried in secret because his own family knew exactly what he'd earned. A world's worth of enemies. At the height of his life, this one man commanded more territory than any human being ever had before him, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the plains of Eastern Europe. Kings who never met him still knew his name, and they were afraid of it. In February of 1258, he did something no army had managed in over 600 years. He brought down the greatest center of learning and power in the Islamic world in a matter of weeks. And the death toll, by some estimates, ran past 1 million people. He didn't stop there. City after city surrendered before he even arrived, just from the stories of what he'd already done. This isn't a story about how far he got. It's about the 7 years after the 7 years it took for the very empire he built to start eating itself alive, one betrayal at a time, until the man who once made kings tremble couldn't control his own family. That family trouble didn't start with betrayal. It started in the cradle. In 1217, a boy was born into the bloodline of Genghis Khan, himself grandson, to the man who had already turned half the known world to ash. Conquest wasn't a career choice for this child. It was inheritance. By the time he could walk, the family business was empire. But the two people who shaped him most weren't warriors at all. His mother, Sorgatani Beki, was a Christian noblewoman running one of the sharpest political minds in the entire Mongol court, and she raised her sons on lessons in power that had nothing to do with a sword. His wife, Dokush Khatun, was Christian too, and for years, she quietly turned his ear against the Muslim world around him. Genghis Khan's grandson, then, grew up surrounded by two devout Christian women and grew into a man who belonged to no faith at all. Not Muslim, not Christian, not Buddhist. He believed in exactly one thing, and it wasn't a god. It was power. And nobody in his family ever taught him what to do with it once he had all of it. In 1255, his older brother, the new great Khan, handed him the answer to that question. Go west and don't stop. Hulagu marched out with roughly 150,000 men, a force so large that entire regions surrendered before it even arrived. The first real resistance he met wasn't an army. It was a sect, the Hashashin, holed up in the mountain fortress of Alamut, a stronghold every general before him had considered unbreakable for over a century. Hulagu took it anyway and reduced it to rubble in weeks. Then came the real target, Baghdad, the intellectual and spiritual capital of the entire Islamic world. February 1258. The city fell. What followed wasn't a battle, it was 40 straight days of slaughter, and historians still argue over how many died, with estimates running anywhere from 200,000 people to over 1 million. Even the low end of that range is almost impossible to picture. He didn't stop there either. Aleppo fell the following year. Damascus opened its gates without a fight. Even the Crusader states in the region bowed to him, gambling that a conqueror raised by two Christian women might spare them. His next target was Egypt, and if Egypt fell too, there would be nothing left standing between him and total control of the Islamic world. Nothing, that is, except one piece of paperwork nobody saw coming. Egypt didn't hold him off with swords. Late in 1259, while Hulagu was in the field preparing that final push, a writer reached him with news from the Mongol homeland. Monk, the great Khan, and his own brother was dead. Mongol law was specific about what happened next. Every senior chief in the empire, no matter where he was or what he was doing, had to return home for the Kurultai, the great council that would choose who ruled next. So Hulagu turned around. He pulled the bulk of his army out of the region and left the invasion in the hands of one general, Kitbuka, with only a fraction of the original force. That was the opening the Muslim world had been waiting for. In Egypt, the Mamluk Sultan gambled everything on a single strike, and in 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, Kitbuka's diminished force was destroyed. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army had lost on an open battlefield. Hulagu wasn't even there to see it. He was hundreds of miles away, buried in succession politics, while the myth of Mongol invincibility died without him. The empire hadn't beaten him yet, but something else already had, and it wasn't waiting on any battlefield. Once the Kurultai settled the succession, his brother Kublai became the new Great Khan. Hulagu was granted his own territory. Modern-day Iran, Iraq, Anatolia, and the Caucasus, a realm that came to be called the Ilkhanate, ruled from a capital at Maragha. For the first time in his life, Hulagu wasn't just conquering, he was governing. And governing turned out to demand something. War never had patience with people he couldn't simply crush. The biggest threat to his new throne didn't come from the Muslim world he just devastated, or the Egyptians who'd humiliated his general. It came from inside his own house. To the north sat the Golden Horde, ruled by his own cousin, Burqa Khan, a fellow grandson of Genghis Khan, and, improbably, a devout convert to the very faith Hulagu had just spent years trying to erase. When Baghdad fell, Burqa Khan didn't stay quiet about it. He said, plainly, that Hulagu had killed the caliph of his own faith, and that blood answered to blood, kinsman or not. War broke out between them on the plains of the Caucasus and dragged on from 1262 to 1265. Mongols killing Mongols. Muslim Mongols against non-Muslim Mongols. A wound inside the family that never closed. It wasn't really about Burqa Khan, though not underneath. Every empire built around one dominant conqueror runs into the same wall, once that conqueror can no longer personally hold it together. Nobody had written down clean rules for who inherited power next, so every death at the top reopened the fight from scratch. It happened here. It happened again a century and a half later, when Timur's own empire tore itself apart within years of his death in 1405, with no single heir strong enough to hold the whole thing. It happened to the Seljuk Turks too, whose territory splintered into rival pieces the moment their strongest ruler, Malik Shah, died in 1092. 3 different empires, 3 different centuries, the exact same failure, a throne built for one man, with no plan for what happened when that man was gone. And in Hulagu's case, that failure wasn't just tearing his empire apart from the outside. It was already running inside his own body. By the early 1260s, Hulagu was falling ill. Historians described something like epilepsy, seizures that grew worse over months until they'd taken over his body completely. In 1265, his wife Dokus Khatun died, and something in him seemed to break that no army ever had. Then, on a winter night near Maraga, the man who had leveled the greatest city in the Islamic world lay in bed, unable to stand, surrounded by nobles and sons who had nothing left to do but wait. This is the detail worth sitting with. The same man whose name alone could make sultans tremble spent his final hours exactly the way every ordinary person does, helpless, silent, waiting for something no army, no empire, and no fortune could stop. In February of 1265, Hulagu Khan died. Not in battle, not by an enemy's hand, in a bed like anyone else. According to Mongol custom, they buried him in secret on an island near Azerbaijan, so no enemy could ever find the grave and take revenge on his bones, the same practice that had hidden Genghis Khan's own resting place a generation earlier. A man who had spent his life impossible to escape had become, in death, impossible to find. Even how he died isn't fully settled. Court chroniclers close to his own dynasty recorded illness, plain and simple. But hostile accounts, written by people who despised him, told a different story. And that split isn't unusual for feared rulers. Centuries earlier, and a continent away, historians left behind at least 3 conflicting versions of how Attila the Hun died. Everything from a drunken accident to murder by his own wife. Powerful men rarely get to control the story of their own ending. What happened to his empire afterward is clearer. It came apart fast. The Golden Horde never forgave him. His own bloodline drifted from Mongol tradition year by year, and by 1295, his grandson Genghis Khan didn't just convert to Islam. He made it the official religion of the very dynasty that had burned Baghdad to the ground. That's not as rare as it sounds. When Manchu clans conquered China in 1644, they arrived determined to keep their own language and customs separate. And within 2 centuries, their descendants were writing poetry in Chinese and could barely speak their ancestors' tongue. When Norman knights took England by force in 1066, their grandchildren were speaking English within a few generations. Armies can win in years. The people being conquered tend to win the centuries that follow, because they simply outlast the memory of who did the conquering. This question why the cruel so often lose, eventually, to the very thing they tried to destroy isn't new, and it never belonged to just one faith. Long before this story, and continents from the world that told it, an ancient Greek line carried the same idea in different words. The mills of the gods grind slowly, wrote the philosopher Sextus Empiricus, but they grind exceedingly fine. Nobody built those mills with Hulagu in mind. People just kept noticing. Across centuries and cultures that never spoke to each other, that cruelty tends to win fast and lose slow. The Hebrew book of Ecclesiastes, written centuries before any of this happened, sits with the same discomfort. The wicked prosper for a while, and then, eventually, they don't. Two traditions, continents apart, landing on the identical conclusion without ever reading each other. Not because one voice whispered it into both ears, because real history, watched closely enough and long enough, keeps producing the same ending, one fallen empire at a time, until it hardens into something worth writing down. Which brings this back to that unmarked grave on an island near Azerbaijan, dug in secret by his own family, so that none of the enemies he'd made could ever find him. Not a monument, not even a name, just proof of exactly how much power a man can hold in one lifetime and how little of it he gets to keep once it's over.